Good evening, and welcome to Lamplight and Historian. I'm Charles. Spain had not yet looked westward. Tonight, the long journey begins quietly, not on an ocean, going ship or in a distant city of silver and stone, but on the Iberian Peninsula at Europe's southwestern edge. Long before Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic, officials governed American cities, or silver travelled from the Andes toward Europe and Asia. A nearer question had to be answered. What did Spain mean then? In the early Middle Ages, there was no single Spanish kingdom stretching neatly from the Pyrenees to the southern coast. The peninsula was divided among different rulers, languages, laws, and religious communities. In the north, Christian kingdoms, such as Castile, Aragon, Leon, and Navarre, held their own territories and pursued their own ambitions. In the south, Muslim ruled states governed fertile lands and important cities whose libraries and systems of learning were known far beyond Iberia. The frontier between these worlds was never simple. It moved gradually, sometimes advancing and sometimes retreating. Christian and Muslim rulers fought one another, but they also negotiated, paid tribute, formed temporary alliances, and occasionally employed soldiers from the other side. The long process, later called the Reconquista, was not one continuous campaign directed by a united nation. It was a changing pattern of warfare, diplomacy, settlement, and rivalry that unfolded over many generations. By the 15th century, the political balance had shifted. Christian kingdoms controlled most of the peninsula, while the Muslim kingdom of Granada remained in the southeast. Granada survived through tribute, careful diplomacy, and the ability to navigate divisions among its more powerful neighbours. Its political position, however, had become increasingly narrow. The frontier's final shift began with a politically risky royal marriage. In 1469, Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon. They were young, and their union was politically controversial. It did not immediately create a single country. Castile and Aragon kept their own laws, institutions, and political traditions. They were different crowns, joined by the rule of the same royal couple, not two administrations, quietly dissolved into one. Even so, the marriage brought together resources that neither kingdom could have commanded in quite the same way alone. Isabella became Queen of Castile after a disputed succession. Ferdinand later inherited the crown of Aragon. Together, they worked to strengthen royal authority and give their rule a clearer religious and political purpose. Catholic unity gave that purpose its clearest form. In 1478, Isabella and Ferdinand established the Spanish Inquisition with royal support. Its early attention fell especially on Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity, who were suspected of continuing their former religious practices in private. The institution helped create a climate in which belief, ancestry, reputation, and political loyalty could become closely connected. Unity, as the monarchs understood it, did not simply mean two crowns cooperating. It also meant a kingdom shaped around one officially protected faith. The same effort to consolidate power soon reached Granada. After a campaign lasting roughly a decade, the kingdom surrendered in January 1492. Muhammad XII, known to the Spanish as Boabdil, gave up the keys of the Alhambra. For Isabella and Ferdinand, the surrender marked the end of the last Muslim-ruled kingdom on the peninsula. It also completed a military project that had occupied much of their reign. Granada mattered for more than the territory it surrendered. Centuries of frontier warfare had created habits and expectations. Military service could offer status. Conquered land could offer reward. Religious expansion could be described as both duty and policy. Men from regions such as Extremadura grew up in a society where ambitious minor nobles might possess a respected family name, but little wealth to support it. Peace did not remove their hunger for advancement. It merely changed the direction in which they might look. And so, in 1492, two objects can help us understand the beginning of the Spanish Empire. The first is a set of keys, the keys of Granada, handed to victorious monarchs at the end of an old Iberian struggle. The second is a map, a map of the Atlantic with wide spaces still uncertain, and with Asia imagined somewhere beyond the western horizon. Only a few months after Granada surrendered, Isabella and Ferdinand agreed to support a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus. His proposal was not to build an empire in unknown continents. He intended to reach the markets of Asia by sailing west. The Crown's decision belonged to a different story, one of geography, calculation, competition, and risk, but it was not entirely separate from what had happened in Granada. The monarchy had spent years organizing men, money, law, and religion around expansion. It had learned how to reward service, claim territory, and present conquest as part of a larger sacred purpose. When the southern frontier closed, that machinery did not simply disappear. The sea offered another direction. The kingdom that looked westward in 1492 was still not uniform. Castile and Aragon remained distinct. Regional identities remained strong. Old religious communities faced growing pressure, and the costs of long warfare had not vanished. But the monarchy now possessed greater confidence, greater authority, and a generation accustomed to the idea that fortune might be found beyond the next frontier. The Spanish Empire did not begin as a finished design. There was no complete plan for a global dominion, no clear vision of cities, mines, missions, and sea routes spread across several continents. There was, instead, a newly strengthened monarchy, an old culture of frontier expansion, and a proposal to send 3 ships westward. Granada's quays closed one era behind them. Across the Atlantic, another frontier waited. The proposal before the Catholic monarchs sounded simple. Christopher Columbus believed Asia could be reached by sailing west from Europe. Educated geographers did not need convincing that the Earth was round. The dispute concerned distance, and on that point, Columbus was badly wrong. Portugal had already spent decades building Europe's strongest maritime program. Its navigators worked south, along Africa's western coast, adding new observations to existing charts and training pilots for longer voyages. Better ships and sustained royal investment supported the effort. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded Africa's southern end and showed that the Atlantic opened into the Indian Ocean. Portuguese advisors could now see an eastern route toward India. It was difficult, but increasingly practical. Columbus offered another direction. He drew on ancient geography, reports associated with Marco Polo, and the calculations of the Florentine mapmaker Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli. From those sources, he argued that Asia lay much closer across the Western Ocean than experienced navigators believed. He estimated roughly 400 miles from the Canary Islands to Japan. The true distance was several times greater. Without the American continents in between, his ships could not have carried enough food and water for the crossing he imagined. Portuguese experts recognized the problem and rejected his plan. Their judgment was not timid. On the size of the Earth, they were more accurate than Columbus. He brought the proposal to Castile in 1486 and eventually received an audience with Queen Isabella. A commission of scholars and advisors examined it for years. They, too, found the distances excessive and the calculations unreliable. Even so, the court never closed the door completely. The decision also reflected the moment at court. Granada had surrendered only months earlier, and the court was still surrounded by officers, clerks, creditors, and petitioners connected to the war. Columbus entered that administrative world with maps, letters, and demands for rank. He was not asking merely for command of a voyage. He wanted authority over places not yet found, and a continuing share of whatever trade followed. Advisors considered those requests excessive, and negotiations nearly failed. Columbus began to leave court before Sant'Angelo and other supporters urged Isabella to reconsider. Their argument was not that his geography had suddenly improved. It was that Castile could afford the gamble. While refusing it might allow another crown to claim the reward, that possibility carried weight after Granada's victory. Columbus stayed nearby, submitted further petitions, and gathered supporters. Luis de Sant'Angelo, a financial official at court, became especially important. When rejection seemed likely, the proposal was framed in practical terms. Failure would cost the crown relatively little. Success might open direct access to Asian trade. Castile had just financed the long war against Granada, so its treasury was under pressure. Still, it had Atlantic ports, ships and sailors. Some supplies could be drawn from obligations owed to the crown. Private money could cover another share, and Columbus would contribute as well. The monarchy was not looking for an unknown American empire. It wanted Asia. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg reached Europe through long commercial chains. Portugal hoped to reach their source by sailing around Africa. A western route would let Castile enter the same trade without following Portugal's path. The possible return was enormous, while the immediate expense remained limited. Isabella and Ferdinand accepted the wager in April 1492. Under the capitulations of Santa Fe, Columbus received unusually generous promises. He would become admiral of the ocean sea, as well as viceroy and governor, general of any lands he discovered. He would also receive a share of their revenue. These terms were easier to grant before anyone knew whether revenue would exist. At Palos de la Frontera, 3 ships were prepared. The Santa Maria, the largest, became the flagship. The Nia and the Pinta were smaller caravels, light enough for Atlantic work. Roughly 90 men joined the expedition. They were not simply prisoners pushed aboard an impossible venture. Most were experienced sailors from Andalusian coastal towns. They understood rigging, currents, changing winds, and the daily maintenance of wooden ships. What none of them knew was how long the ocean would remain empty ahead. The fleet left Palos on the 3rd of August 1492, then stopped in the Canary Islands for repairs and fresh supplies. From there, the ships turned west. For 33 days, the horizon showed water in every direction. The crossing was not one continuous battle with storms. Steady trade winds carried the ships west at a useful pace. The unease came from distance. Men accustomed to travelling between known coasts watched day after day pass without land. Changes in compass readings caused concern. Floating vegetation raised hopes, but open water kept returning. The surviving account says Columbus kept one set of distance figures for himself and gave the crew smaller numbers, perhaps to contain their anxiety. Whatever method he used, he remained certain that Asian islands must be close. On the 12th of October, Rodrigo de Triana, a lookout aboard the Pinta, saw land. The island was somewhere in the Bahamas. Its precise modern identification remains debated. Though San Salvador is usually associated with the landing, Columbus went ashore, claimed it for Castile, and gave it a Christian name. The people already living there understood the arrival through experiences entirely different from his Columbus, interpreted what he saw through expectations carried from Europe. He thought he had reached islands near Asia. He noticed small gold ornaments, the absence of iron weapons, and what he considered an opportunity for conversion. Observation and calculation were already becoming difficult to separate. The news unsettled Portugal. Earlier agreements had tried to define Portuguese rights of exploration, but existing maps offered no clear answer to the western voyage. Spain and Portugal responded in 1494 with the Treaty of Tordesillas. They drew an imagined line from north to south through the Atlantic. Lands east of it would fall within Portugal's sphere. Lands west of it would belong to Spain. European rulers were dividing territories they scarcely understood. The Spanish crown had risked a modest sum on 3 ships, an uncertain route, and a navigator whose central calculation was wrong. It did not find the western passage to Asia it expected. Instead, the voyage opened contact with lands and peoples that would transform Spain, the Atlantic, and the wider world. The wager had ended. Possession was beginning. The Caribbean exposed the voyage's deeper consequences. Possession began inside a misunderstanding. When Columbus stepped ashore in the Caribbean, the people who first met him had no way of knowing what 3 small ships would eventually mean. Nor did the newcomers understand the world before them. Each side observed the other through its own expectations, and curiosity, generosity, calculation, and danger were already intertwined. The Tarsino communities of the Caribbean were not inhabitants of an empty or motionless world. They lived in organized villages, led by chiefs known as caciques. They cultivated cassava, maize, and sweet potatoes, fished the surrounding waters, and maintained networks of travel and exchange between islands. Their societies had their own alliances, rivalries, and religious traditions. Columbus saw only fragments of this larger pattern. He noticed that the people he encountered did not carry iron weapons. He observed small pieces of gold worn as ornaments and repeatedly asked where more could be found. Through gestures and incomplete interpretation, he concluded that richer sources must lie on larger islands nearby. He also believed conversion to Christianity would be easy, because he could not recognize the forms of Taino religious life. He described them as having no religion. Glass beads, red caps, and other objects were exchanged, but the meaning of those exchanges was not shared equally. What the Taino may have understood as hospitality or diplomacy, Columbus increasingly interpreted as submission. Several Taino people were taken aboard the ships to serve as guides, interpreters, and proof of the voyage when Columbus returned to Spain. Their consent was not part of the decision. The ships continued through the islands. Columbus explored part of Cuba, which he associated with Japan, and then reached the island he called La Espaciola, later known as Hispaniola. There, signs of gold encouraged him to remain. Relations were cautious, but initially included trade and cooperation. One cacique, Quacanaga, assisted the Spanish after the Santa Maria ran onto a reef on Christmas Day in 1492. The flagship could not be saved, so its timber was used to build a fortified settlement on the northern coast. He called the settlement La Navidad. 39 men remained behind. They were instructed to preserve peaceful relations, explore the country, and gather gold while Columbus returned to Spain. The arrangement depended on discipline and cooperation with nearby communities. The arrangement quickly failed. Columbus sailed for Europe in January 1493, carrying plants, a small quantity of gold, and several Taino captives. Before reaching court, he arranged for a letter describing the voyage to circulate in print. It emphasized fertile islands, friendly inhabitants, prospects for conversion, and signs of wealth. An uncertain expedition became a public success. When Isabella and Ferdinand received him, the meeting was conducted with ceremony. The people and objects he brought gave physical form to places most Europeans had never imagined. The small amount of gold mattered less than the possibility that much more might follow. A larger second expedition followed almost at once. This time, 17 vessels carried around 1,200 people across the Atlantic. Among them were priests, soldiers, craftsmen, farmers, and officials. They brought animals, tools, seed, weapons, and the beginnings of an administration. The first voyage tested a route, the second planted a colony. When the fleet returned to La Navidad, the settlement had been destroyed, and the men left there were dead. The surviving explanations were incomplete, but the outline was clear. Rather than respecting local agreements, the colonists had spread through the countryside, demanded gold, seized food, and taken women. Taino communities eventually resisted. The goodwill that had sustained La Navidad was gone. Columbus selected a new site on Hispaniola and established La Isabela. It was intended to become a lasting European town with storehouses, workshops, a church, and buildings for royal administration. Yet the site was poorly chosen. Food was uncertain, disease spread among the settlers, and the surrounding land did not produce what they expected. Many colonists had crossed the Atlantic imagining gold and advancement. Instead, they were asked to clear ground, raise walls, repair equipment, and survive unfamiliar conditions. Complaints multiplied. Columbus, whose navigation had carried the expedition across the ocean, proved less successful at managing a colony divided by sickness, disappointment, and competition. Pressure to find gold increased. A tribute system was imposed on Taino communities. Adults in designated areas were required to provide fixed quantities of gold at regular intervals. Where gold was scarce, other tribute and labor were demanded. Failure brought severe and sometimes mutilating punishment. The colonists expected rewards for the risks they had taken, while the crown expected the islands to justify its investment. Tassino labor and resources became the means through which those expectations were enforced. The losses soon spread across the island. The number of Taíno living on Hispaniola when Columbus arrived remains uncertain. Estimates range from hundreds of thousands to several million. The starting figure is debated, but the direction of events is not. Within a few generations, the Taíno population of the island had collapsed. European diseases caused the greatest destruction. Smallpox, measles, and other illnesses entered communities with no previous exposure and spread rapidly. Forced labor, hunger, displacement, and violence deepened the loss. Villages could not recover as quickly as people were dying or being removed. This established a pattern that would appear, with important differences, wherever Spanish settlement expanded. Initial contact, demands for labor and tribute, resistance, military pressure, and epidemics that moved beyond the direct control of any government or army. Columbus continued to sail. On his third voyage, in 1498, he reached the northern coast of South America and saw the enormous volume of fresh water flowing from the Orinoco River. It suggested a landmass far larger than an island. He began to speak of a new world, though he never completely abandoned the belief that Asia remained nearby. His fourth voyage took him along Central America as he searched for a passage into the Indian Ocean. He did not find one. By his death in 1506, he had lost his governorship of Hispaniola after complaints about his administration and was still disputing whether the crown had honoured its promises. The continents would not carry his name. That came from Amerigo Vespucci, whose accounts argued more clearly that these lands were not Asia. A map printed by Martin Wald-Seam used the name America, and it remained. Columbus had crossed the Atlantic looking for a road to Asia. What followed was not the trade route he imagined, but the beginning of a colonial world. The islands were now claimed by Castile. The Taíno world was being broken apart. Beyond the Caribbean, other shores waited at the edges of Spanish maps. The men already preparing to travel toward those shores would carry very different ambitions with them. Ambition now moved beyond the Caribbean. The Caribbean's next expeditions were not units of a royal army carrying out a complete plan from Spain. Settlers, soldiers, sailors, minor nobles, priests, investors, and debtors moved together in a varied, often quarrelsome company. Many still shared one condition more strongly than wealth. They wanted to acquire it, and they were already preparing to leave. Few possessed wealth already. Most hoped the Caribbean would yield land, labor, or office. Spanish society had a name for one important group among them, the hidalgos. A hidalgo belonged to the lower nobility. He might inherit a respected family name and the right to claim social standing, yet possess little land and even less income. Honor could be inherited more easily than comfort. In a kingdom emerging from centuries of frontier warfare, there were many men with military experience and few obvious places to use it. For an ambitious man with limited property, the Caribbean appeared to offer something Castile could not: the possibility of beginning again with land, labor, and authority of his own. A notable number came from Extremadura in western Castile. Hernan Cortés was born in Medellín. Francisco Pizarro came from Trujillo. Vasco Enes de Balboa and other future leaders of conquest emerged from the same broad frontier culture where warfare, social advancement, religious purpose, and the acquisition of land had long been closely connected. Yet private ambition alone could not create an empire. The crown needed a method for turning personal expeditions into royal expansion. The usual instrument was a contract called a capitulación. A Wood, be leader, presented a proposal describing where he intended to sail and what service he promised to perform. The crown granted permission and specified the titles and rewards that might follow success. In return, a share of any wealth discovered belonged to the royal treasury. The most familiar share was the quinto real, the royal fifth, 20% of certain treasure and precious metals claimed by the crown. The arrangement was economical from Madrid's point of view. The expedition leader generally had to find his own ships, recruit his own men, and raise much of his own money. If the venture failed, the loss rested mainly on its organisers. If it succeeded, the crown gained territory and revenue without paying the full cost in advance. This system encouraged bold action, but it also encouraged rivalry. Men who had mortgaged their futures expected visible results. Partnerships could dissolve when gold, land, or offices became available. Expedition leaders competed with governors, and former allies accused one another of withholding treasure or exceeding their authority. Royal permission therefore mattered greatly, even when it was incomplete, disputed, or ignored. Legal language mattered just as much. In 1513, Spanish jurists produced a declaration known as the Requerimiento. It was intended to be read to indigenous communities before military action. The text explained, from the Spanish point of view, the authority of Christianity, the Pope, and the Spanish crown. Its listeners were asked to accept royal rule and Christian teaching peacefully. The contradiction was immediate. The declaration was usually delivered in Spanish to people who did not understand it. At times it was read from a ship or in circumstances where no meaningful response was possible. Refusal, silence, or incomprehension could then be treated as justification for war and enslavement. The document did not create genuine consent. It gave conquest the appearance of procedure. Bartolomé de las Casas, who had participated in the early colonial world before becoming one of its strongest critics, regarded the declaration as a hollow performance. His objection reflected a wider tension within the Spanish project. The empire used law constantly, yet law could be written to protect decisions already made. Religion brought the same contradiction into daily practice. Priests accompanied expeditions because conversion was presented as one of their central purposes. Franciscan and Dominican missionaries saw the Americas as an immense field for Christian teaching. Some learned local languages, defended indigenous communities, and condemned the treatment they witnessed. Their criticism often came from believing that forced labor and violence made sincere conversion impossible. At the same time, the Church supplied much of the language that justified expansion. The papal grant issued after Columbus's first voyage linked Spain's territorial claims to the obligation to spread Christianity. An expedition could therefore be described as a search for wealth, an act of royal service, and a religious mission at once. Few men illustrated the possibilities of this system more clearly than Vasco Núñez de Balboa. Balboa arrived in Hispaniola as a settler, attempted farming, and accumulated debts. To escape his creditors, he concealed himself aboard a ship sailing toward Panama. Once there, he proved resourceful enough to become a leader of the struggling settlement at Darien through relationships with local indigenous leaders. He heard accounts of another sea beyond the mountains and of wealthy lands farther south. In 1513, Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama with a force that included Spaniards and several hundred indigenous allies. After travelling through difficult country, he climbed a height from which he could see a vast body of water on the other side of the continent. A few days later, he entered the water and claimed the sea, along with the lands touching it, for the Crown of Castile. The claim was larger than anything he could control, yet it revealed the assumptions behind early Spanish expansion. A journey funded through private risk could become a royal possession through ceremony, legal language, and the confidence to speak for distant authority. Disease was moving through the same world, though the Spaniards did not understand it. Epidemics spread outward from contact points along indigenous routes, sometimes reaching communities before any Spanish expedition arrived. They were not a deliberate weapon, but their effects could alter the balance of power as decisively as an army. By 1519, Spain controlled much of the Caribbean and had established footholds along the mainland coasts. Reports were arriving from the west of a large and organized civilization in the interior of Mexico. The governor of Cuba selected Hernán Cortés to lead an expedition toward it. Before departure, the governor tried to reverse his decision. Cortés sailed anyway. Cortés approached the city in the lake. Cortés left Cuba. In February 1519, he sailed from Cuba with 11 ships, roughly 550 armed men, a small number of horses, and several cannons. The force was too small to conquer a densely populated country, by ordinary military calculation. It was also travelling under uncertain authority. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, had first approved the expedition and then attempted to cancel it. Cortés had already invested heavily in ships, equipment, and recruitment. Rather than surrender the venture, he accelerated his departure and sailed before the governor could stop him. From that moment, he needed more than exploration. He needed a success large enough to persuade the Spanish crown to overlook the irregular manner in which he had begun. After reaching the coast of Mexico, Cortés established a settlement called Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz. He appointed his own supporters to its town council, and that council then named him captain general. The arrangement was carefully circular. Cortés claimed that he no longer answered to the governor of Cuba, because he had been appointed by a legally constituted town, acting in the name of the king. He sent reports and gifts directly to Charles I of Spain, who also ruled much of Europe as the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Cortés was not merely moving inland. He was building a legal explanation for everything he intended to do. He also made sure that retreat would be difficult. The ships were disabled, so that dissatisfied men could not simply return to Cuba. Whatever happened next, the expedition would face it together. The first important political lesson came from the Totonac people living near the coast. They were subjects of the Mexica, the people often called the Aztecs, whose capital was Tenochtitlan. Totonac communities paid tribute in goods, such as textiles, cacao, rubber, and other valuable materials. Their obligations to the imperial center had created resentment. Cortés understood very little of this world when he arrived. His most important source of knowledge was a young woman known as Malintzin. She had been given to the Spaniards after an encounter on the coast. Malintzin spoke both a Mayan language and Nahuatl, the language used by the Mexica and many other peoples of central Mexico. Another Spanish interpreter knew Mayan and Spanish. At first, Cortés's words passed through this chain of languages. Before long, Malintzin also learned Spanish and became his principal interpreter. To the Spaniards, she became Dua Marina. Later traditions would call her La Malinche. Her role went far beyond repeating words. She interpreted diplomatic customs, explained political relationships, listened to messengers, and warned Cortés when language carried meanings he might otherwise miss. Horses and steel gave the Spaniards unfamiliar military advantages, but neither could explain who governed a town, which communities paid tribute, or which enemies might be willing to become allies. Without Malintzin, the expedition would have crossed central Mexico nearly blind. As Cortés marched inland, he entered the territory of Tlaxcala, a confederation that had resisted Mexican dominations for generations. The Tlaxcalans did not immediately welcome the strangers. They fought them for several days. The Spanish force came close to being overwhelmed. The horses, armour and firearms were unsettling, but they did not make the expedition invincible. Cortés's men were far from the coast, dependent on uncertain supplies, and surrounded by warriors who knew the land. The Tlaxcalan leadership eventually made a political calculation. The newcomers were dangerous, but they were also enemies of Tenochtitlan. An alliance might offer an opportunity that years of independent resistance had not provided. That alliance changed what the expedition could attempt. When Cortés continued toward the Mexica capital, his few hundred Spaniards were accompanied by thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors. More indigenous allies would join later. They brought soldiers, food, local knowledge, and motives of their own. The fall of Tenochtitlan would therefore not be the simple story of a small European army defeating an entire indigenous civilization. It was also a conflict among indigenous states and communities, with the Spaniards acting as a new and highly disruptive force inside older rivalries. In November 1519, the Allied column entered the Valley of Mexico. Ahead stood a city unlike anything the Spaniards knew. Tenochtitlan had been built on an island in Lake Texcoco. Broad causeways connected it to the surrounding shore. Canals passed between districts, carrying canoes filled with people and goods. Aqueducts brought fresh water from the mainland. At Tlatelolco, an enormous market served tens of thousands of buyers and sellers. Goods arrived from across the empire: food, cloth, pottery, feathers, tools, medicines, precious stones, and luxury objects intended for nobles and temples. Spanish witnesses, familiar with important cities in Europe, described the scale and order of the market with open admiration. At the ceremonial heart of the city stood the Templo Mayor, the great temple complex associated with the religious and political life of the Mexican state. Estimates of Tenochtitlan's population vary, but it was almost certainly larger than any city in Spain, to the newcomers approaching along the causeway. Its buildings appeared to rise directly from the water. Moctezuma II received court teas with formal ceremony. Nobles accompanied the ruler, gifts were exchanged, and the Spaniards were given quarters inside the city. Why Moctezuma admitted the strangers into Tenochtitlan remains an open historical question. Any familiar story claims that he believed Cortés might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl. Much of that interpretation comes from accounts shaped after the conquest, and it does not fully explain Moctezuma's actions. A political explanation is more likely. He faced a strange but limited foreign force, surrounded by thousands of indigenous warriors. By bringing the visitors into the capital, he could observe them, question them, display the wealth and power of his city, and perhaps control their movements. Cortés read the same hospitality as an opening. Within weeks, the Spaniards took Moctezuma hostage. The ruler continued to appear in public and issue commands, but he did so while living under Spanish control. Cortés hoped that authority over the emperor would allow him to govern the empire indirectly. For several months, the arrangement held together uneasily. Then news arrived from the coast. The governor of Cuba had sent a force of roughly 900 men to arrest Cortés and end his unauthorized campaign. Cortés left part of his force in Tenochtitlan and marched east to confront them. He defeated the expedition and persuaded many of its soldiers to join him. The victory increased his numbers, but during his absence, the situation in the capital collapsed. Pedro de Alvarado, the commander left behind, ordered an attack during the festival of Tenochtitlan. Mexican nobles, priests, and other participants had gathered for a major religious ceremony. Alvarado later claimed that he feared an uprising, though the exact circumstances remain disputed. The attack destroyed what remained of the fragile political arrangement. The people of Tenochtitlan rose against the Spanish garrison. Cortés returned to a capital already in open resistance. Moctezuma was brought forward in an attempt to calm the population. He was struck during the confrontation and died soon afterward. Accounts disagree over precisely how he received his fatal injuries, and the uncertainty has never been completely resolved. Without him, the Spaniards could no longer maintain the appearance that they governed through the existing imperial order. On the night of the 30th of June, 1520, Cortés and his allies attempted to escape along the causeways. The Spanish later remembered the retreat as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. They moved through darkness, carrying weapons, supplies, and treasure taken from the city. Mexican warriors attacked from canoes and from positions along the narrow route. Sections of the causeway had been opened, leaving gaps of water that had to be crossed under pressure. Many men fell into the lake. Some were burdened by gold they had chosen to carry. The Spaniards lost a large part of their force, but Cortés escaped. More importantly, the surviving Spaniards still had the support of Tlaxcala. The alliance had suffered severely, yet it had not disappeared. Cortés spent the following months rebuilding. Reinforcements and supplies arrived from the coast. Small boats were constructed in sections, carried overland, and assembled on Lake Texcoco so that the Allies could challenge Mexican canoes and control movement across the water. Meanwhile, smallpox had entered the city. Smallpox spread through Tenochtitlan. The disease had been introduced through European contact and moved through a population with no previous exposure. It killed ordinary residents, soldiers, officials, and political leaders. Those who survived were left to care for the sick, while also preparing for another attack. The epidemic did not conquer the city by itself. but it weakened Tenochtitlan at the moment when Cortes and a much larger indigenous coalition returned. The siege opened in 1521. Causeways were attacked, water supplies disrupted, and food became scarce. Spanish vessels operated on the lake, while Tlaxcalan and other allied forces pressed toward the city from the shore. Fighting continued district by district as the defenders withdrew into an increasingly narrow area. The last Mexica ruler, Cuauhtémoc, organized the resistance after the deaths of earlier leaders. On the 13th of August, 1521, he was captured while attempting to cross the lake by canoe. By August, the siege was over. Tenochtitlan had not fallen to 500 Spaniards acting alone. It had fallen after years of imperial resentment had brought thousands of indigenous enemies into alliance with them. It had fallen after political decisions on every side produced consequences, no leader fully controlled. And it had fallen while epidemic disease moved through the city alongside hunger and war. The island capital lay badly damaged. On its foundations, Cortes began constructing a new colonial capital. Temples and palaces were dismantled, while stones from the old city entered the walls of the new one. The causeways, waterways, markets, and labour of the valley did not disappear, but they were reorganized under another political order. The rebuilt capital took the name Mexico City. It would become the centre of New Spain and one of the most important cities in the Spanish Empire. Tenochtitlan, the city in the lake, had fallen. The greater challenge would be learning how to govern what conquest had placed in Spanish hands. Farther south, Pizarro approached an empire already divided. The conquest of Mexico had shown how a small Spanish expedition could enter a far larger political world and survive by attaching itself to existing divisions. Far to the south, another group of men was preparing to attempt something similar. Francisco Pizarro led them. Pizarro had been born in Trujillo, in Extremadura, the same western region of Castile that had produced so many of the men crossing the Atlantic. He was the illegitimate son of a minor military officer and received little formal education. He could not read or write, and for much of his adult life, he moved through the Caribbean and Central American colonies without achieving the fortune he expected. He had been present when Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and saw the Pacific. From indigenous traders and coastal communities, he heard accounts of a wealthy state somewhere to the south. Pizarro made 2 unsuccessful attempts to find it. His expeditions suffered from disease, hunger, uncertain supplies, and men who had been promised wealth but encountered difficult coastlines and tropical forests instead. By the time he prepared for another voyage, Pizarro was already in his 50s. He had spent decades waiting for the opportunity that younger men such as Cortes had found more quickly. Before a third attempt, he returned to Spain. In 1529, Pizarro appeared before the royal court, carrying examples of Peruvian gold and textiles, along with llamas and several people taken from the coast. The object suggested that the reports from the south were not merely stories. The crown granted him a capitulacy. In authorizing the conquest of Peru, Pizarro received the titles of governor and captain, general over lands he might claim. As with other conquest contracts, the royal document gave legal form to an expedition that would still depend largely on private risk. Pizarro returned to Panama and assembled a force of only 168 men. They had 60, 2 horses, and 1 small cannon. By any ordinary calculation, they were not an army capable of conquering an empire of many millions. The empire ahead of them, however, was already in crisis. Its people called it Tawantinsuyu, the 4 regions. It extended along the Andes from what is now southern Colombia through Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, and into parts of Chile and Argentina. Mountain ranges, high plateaus, deserts, and deep valleys made its geography difficult. Yet the Inca state had connected this territory with a road system stretching for tens of thousands of kilometers. Roads crossed steep slopes and barren country, linking cities, administrative centers, military posts, and storehouses. Officials recorded obligations and organized labor across the empire. Through a system known as the meter, communities supplied periods of work to the state. This labor supported roads, farms, construction, armies, and mines. Warehouses positioned along major routes stored food, clothing, tools, and military supplies. In times of drought or disruption, these reserves could help support both local populations and travelling armies. Tawantinsuyu was not a loose collection of villages waiting to be claimed. It was one of the largest and most carefully organised states in the Americas. Its scale depended on political stability. Around 1527, the ruler Huayna Capac died during an epidemic that had moved through the Andes ahead of the main Spanish expedition. The illness was probably smallpox, carried inland through earlier networks of contact. His death opened a struggle over succession. Two of his sons emerged as rivals. Huáscar was based in Cuzco, the traditional capital. Atahualpa commanded powerful armies in the north. Their competition became a civil war that divided military leaders, noble families, and entire regions. By 1532, Atahualpa had won, Huáscar had been captured, and the armies loyal to the northern faction controlled the empire. Victory had already exacted a cost. The war had weakened administrative structures, exhausted armies, and created deep resentment among communities associated with the defeated side. Atahualpa had gained the throne of an empire that was powerful in appearance, but politically unsettled beneath the surface. Pizarro entered the Andes at precisely this moment. Atahualpa knew that the strangers had arrived on the coast. Reports described their unusual animals, metal weapons, and ships, yet their small number may have made them appear more curious than dangerous. Near the city of Cajamarca, Atahualpa had tens of thousands of soldiers available. A force of fewer than 200 foreigners could hardly have seemed capable of threatening his rule. Rather than preventing their passage through the mountains, he allowed them to approach. On the 16th of November 1532, Pizarro invited Atahualpa to meet him in the central plaza of Cajamarca. The Inca ruler arrived in ceremony, carried on a litter, and surrounded by attendants. Many of his soldiers remained outside the square or entered without the expectation of an immediate battle. Spanish soldiers waited out of sight around the plaza. A priest named Vicente de Valverde approached Atahualpa, carrying a cross and a Bible. Through an interpreter, he presented a shortened version of the claims used to justify Spanish conquest. He described Christian authority and asked the ruler to recognize the supremacy of the Spanish crown. Atahualpa examined the book. The encounter that followed has been described in different ways. He may have rejected it deliberately, or he may not have understood why the object itself carried such importance for the Spaniards. When the Bible fell, or was thrown to the ground, Valverde declared that the offer had been refused. Pizarro signalled the attack. The cannon fired, horses entered the square, and Spanish soldiers advanced from their concealed positions. The tightly gathered attendants had little room to respond to an attack they had not expected. The Spaniards dragged Atahualpa from his litter and captured him alive. The capture of the ruler mattered far more than the small size of Pizarro's force. The Spanish now held the figure at the centre of an empire, still recovering from civil war. Officials, generals, and communities across Tawantinsuyu had to decide whether to obey Atahualpa's commands, resist the foreigners, or pursue their own interests. While in captivity, Atahualpa recognized that the Spaniards placed extraordinary value on gold and silver. Atahualpa proposed a ransom. According to the agreement, the room in which he was held would be filled with gold as high as his raised hand could reach. 2 nearby rooms would be filled with silver. In exchange, he expected his freedom. Precious objects began to arrive from across the empire. Ornaments, temple furnishings, and works created for political or religious purposes were removed from their original settings and carried to Cajamarca. To the Inca, these objects possessed meanings tied to rulers, temples, ancestors, and sacred places. For the Spaniards, the objects became metal. The objects were melted down, weighed, and divided. The royal fifth was reserved for the crown. The remaining treasure was distributed among Pizarro's men according to their rank and role in the expedition. The payment made many Spaniards wealthy. It did not purchase Atahualpa's freedom. The Spaniards feared that armies loyal to him might be preparing an attack. They also understood that releasing him could restore a center of authority capable of organizing resistance. Atahualpa was placed on trial. The accusations included rebellion against Spanish authority and religious practices condemned by the newcomers. The proceedings supplied legal form to a decision that had largely been made already. He was sentenced to death by burning. Because this threatened beliefs surrounding the treatment of his body, he accepted baptism and was instead executed by strangulation on the 26th of July, 1533. Pizarro next marched south toward Cuzco. The Inca capital contained palaces, temples, plazas, and storehouses filled with goods produced through the labor of communities across the empire. Its carefully fitted stone buildings impressed the Spaniards, even as they stripped the city of precious metal. At the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sunday, sheets and ornaments of gold were removed. Pizarro attempted to rule through the existing political structure. He installed a young Inca prince named Manco as ruler, expecting him to lend legitimacy to Spanish demands while local systems of tribute and administration continued to function. Manco did not stay obedient. In 1536, he organized a major uprising and surrounded Cuzco with an enormous army. The siege continued for months. The Spanish and their allies narrowly retained control of the city, while Manco withdrew into the mountains. An independent Inca state survived at Vilcabamba for 36 more years. The Spanish also began fighting among themselves. Pizarro's longtime associate Diego de Almagro believed he had received an unfair share of the new territories. After an unsuccessful expedition into Chile, he returned and challenged the Pizarro faction for control of Cuzco. The dispute became a civil conflict among the conquerors. Almagro was captured and executed in 1538. 3 years later, his supporters entered Pizarro's residence in Lima and killed him. By then, the old Inca Empire had been broken apart. Its roads, labor systems, storehouses, and administrative divisions had not simply vanished. Many would be taken over and adapted by the new colonial government. Spanish victory did not produce immediate order. It produced overlapping claims, indigenous resistance, private rivalries, and a vast territory that a few expedition leaders could not govern alone. The era of the independent conquistador was closing. The crown would now have to build a machine capable of controlling the conquerors, organizing labor, collecting revenue, and ruling across an ocean. Only then could the wealth of the Andes begin moving steadily toward Spain. Victory had to become lasting government. Before wealth could be collected year after year, conquest had to become regular government. Only then could Andean wealth move steadily towards Spain. A military victory might capture a ruler or occupy a capital. It could not, by itself, administer towns, settle disputes, organize labor, collect taxes, appoint priests, register ships, or carry royal instructions across an ocean. The crown faced another problem, less visible but equally urgent. It had to control the conquerors. The men who had crossed the Atlantic were not ordinary royal employees. Many had financed their own expeditions, recruited their own followers, and accepted the possibility of debt or death when they succeeded. They expected land, titles, labor, and a share of the treasure. They believed personal risk had earned those rewards in full. From the crown's perspective, allowing private conquerors to become independent rulers would replace distant indigenous empires with distant Spanish ones. The monarchy therefore spent much of the 16th century trying to bring the new territories under a more regular system of law and administration. It did not always succeed. Orders took months to cross the Atlantic, officials served far from supervision, and local wealth created powerful interests that resisted interference. Still, the crown attempted to build a structure that could outlast the individuals who had carried out the first conquests. One early instrument was the encomienda. Under this arrangement, royal authority assigned an encomendero the right to receive labor or tribute from a particular indigenous community. In return, the encomendero was expected to protect the people entrusted to him and provide instruction in Christianity. On paper, the system was described as one of obligation in both directions. In practice, power was distributed anything but equally. Spanish settlers controlled military force, local offices, and access to colonial courts. Indigenous communities were required to provide goods, labour, or tribute under conditions they had not chosen. The language of protection often concealed an arrangement built on compulsion. The Crown understood the danger early. If settlers exhausted the population through excessive demands, the colonial economy would eventually weaken. Reports from priests and royal officials also described conditions that raised serious moral and legal questions. In 1512, the laws of Burgos attempted to regulate indigenous labour. They included rules concerning food, housing, rest, religious instruction, and particular forms of mistreatment. Yet laws written in Spain were only as effective as the people enforcing them in the Americas. Local officials were often encomenderos themselves, or belonged to families that benefited from the system. The distance from royal supervision gave them considerable room to interpret, delay, or ignore unwanted instructions. Bartolomé de las Casas became one of colonial labour's strongest and most persistent critics. Las Casas had arrived in the Caribbean and had once benefited from an encomienda of his own. In 1514, while preparing a sermon, he experienced what he later described as a moral transformation. He gave up his claim to indigenous labour, entered the Dominican order, and spent much of the rest of his life arguing that the conquest had produced profound injustice. He wrote petitions, appeared at court, debated other scholars, and described colonial abuses in language intended to disturb the conscience of the monarchy. His criticism was not offered from outside the Spanish world. It emerged from within its church, law, and imperial administration that made it more difficult to dismiss. In 1542, Emperor Charles V issued regulations known as the New Laws. They attempted to restrict the encomienda system and prevent grants from becoming permanent hereditary possessions. Existing encomiendas were eventually supposed to return to the crown rather than pass automatically to the holder's descendants. For the monarchy, this would protect royal authority and reduce some of the worst abuses. Many colonists saw instead a threat to rewards they considered earned. Resistance was immediate. In Peru, opposition became an armed rebellion. The first viceroy sent to apply the new regulations was captured and killed by rebellious settlers. Faced with the danger of losing control of the colony, the crown retreated from some of the law's strongest provisions. The conflict established a pattern repeated across the empire. The monarchy issued rules. Colonial elites resisted. Officials negotiated compromises. The final result often looked very different from the original order. Even when reforms failed, however, they established important principles. Indigenous people were legally described as free subjects of the crown, rather than the private property of settlers. The crown claimed ultimate authority over labour, land, and colonial offices. Legal principle and daily reality could stand very far apart. But the legal principle remained available to indigenous communities, priests, lawyers, and royal officials who wished to challenge local power. An expanding bureaucracy rose above this disputed ground. The Council of the Indies, established in Madrid in 1524, became the highest governing body for Spain's overseas territories. It reviewed colonial legislation, advised the monarch, selected or recommended officials, heard appeals, and sent instructions across the Atlantic. Its members governed distant places that most of them would never visit. Information arrived through letters, court records, maps, reports, petitions, and formal investigations. A dispute in Mexico or Peru might pass through several levels of administration before reaching Madrid. A royal answer might then require months to return. The system was slow, but it produced an extraordinary written record. The Spanish Empire became an empire of paper as well as ships and soldiers. Commerce was supervised through another institution, the Casa de Contratación, or House of Trade, established in Seville in 1503. Legal trade between Spain and the American territories was expected to pass through its system. The Casa registered ships and passengers, collected taxes, issued licenses, trained pilots, maintained navigation charts, and recorded the movement of colonial goods. Seville became the American Empire's main European gateway for ships, passengers, cargo, and accounts. Cargoes arrived there, carrying products from across the Atlantic. Officials inspected manifests, merchants negotiated contracts, and royal accountants calculated what belonged to the treasury. The wealth of distant colonies passed through offices, warehouses, docks, and ledgers before it entered the wider European economy. The largest American territories were organized as viceroyalties. The Viceroyalty of New Spain was established in 1535, with Mexico City as its capital. The Viceroyalty of Peru followed in 1542, governed from Lima. Each was headed by a viceroy who represented the monarch. He possessed broad civil and military authority, but he was not intended to rule without limits. His decisions could be reviewed, his conduct investigated, and his term brought to an end. Below the viceroys stood audiencias, high courts that also carried administrative responsibilities. Local officials governed provinces, towns, and districts, collecting tribute and carrying royal policy into communities far from the capitals. Overlapping authority was deliberate. A viceroy might be checked by an audiencia. A bishop might object to a governor. A royal inspector might arrive without warning. An indigenous community might appeal a local decision to a higher court. This overlap could produce confusion, delay, and rivalry. It also prevented any single colonial official from exercising completely independent power. The Catholic Church supplied another network within the system. Through the royal patronage granted to the Spanish monarchy, the Crown exercised considerable influence over church appointments and organization in the Americas. Bishops, parishes, monasteries, and missions became part of colonial government, as well as religious life. Missionaries attempted to convert indigenous populations, but effective preaching required communication. Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and later Jesuits studied local languages and produced grammars, dictionaries, and religious texts. Bernardino de Sahagun worked with Nahua scholars and informants to record histories, beliefs, ceremonies, and accounts of the conquest. The result became one of the most important surviving records of central Mexican life. Here the empire's contradictions became difficult to separate. The same process that damaged indigenous institutions also produced detailed efforts to describe them. Missionaries might destroy religious objects while preserving accounts of the beliefs attached to them. Churchmen could support imperial rule while condemning the actions of settlers. In 1550 and 1551, these tensions were expressed in a formal debate at Valladolid. The scholar Juan Gins de Sepsilve had argued that conquest could be justified and drew upon ideas of natural hierarchy. Las Casas insisted that indigenous peoples were rational human beings with political communities and rights of their own. The debate produced no simple verdict. Imperial rule continued. By then, the system was too extensive and its profits too important for those in power to consider withdrawal. Instead, Spain attempted to regulate conquest without surrendering its results. What emerged was a layered colonial order, indigenous labor, organized through Spanish law. Local officials watched by distant councils, merchants supervised by royal accountants, and missionaries working beside soldiers and magistrates. The system was inconsistent and often exploitative. It also proved durable. It could survive the death of a conqueror, the rebellion of a settler, and the replacement of one viceroy by another. The administration now needed enough reliable revenue to maintain offices, fleets, armies, and dynastic ambitions. High in the Andes, a reddish mountain would provide it. Cerro Rico powered the imperial system. The mine would bind Andean labor, mercury, royal taxation, and European credit to the same high altitude city. According to one story, often repeated throughout the colonial period, a Quechua herder named Diego Hualpa spent a cold night on the mountain in 1545. He lit a fire for warmth, and the heat revealed silver in the rock beneath it. The precise details of the story are difficult to confirm. Like many accounts of great discoveries, it became simpler and more dramatic each time it was told. The mining boom is clearer. The mountain contained one of the richest concentrations of silver ore ever brought under Spanish control. The Spaniards named it Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. Within a year, a mining settlement appeared at its base. Within a decade, the settlement had become a city. By the following century, Potosí was one of the largest urban centers in the world. It stood high on the Andean plateau, where the air was thin and the climate severe. New arrivals struggled to breathe and required time to adjust. Food, timber, tools, animals, and nearly every other necessity had to be carried across long distances. There was little reason for a city of such size to exist in this landscape, except for the mountain. That single mountain was enough. Merchants arrived to sell food and equipment. Officials came to measure production and collect taxes. Priests established churches. Craftsmen repaired tools and constructed buildings. Lawyers, traders, labor contractors, and royal accountants followed. A mint transformed refined silver into coins. Markets supplied a population that had grown around extraction. The city developed theatres, religious houses, workshops, gambling rooms, and elaborate homes for those who profited from the mine. Potosí grew rich, crowded, and sharply unequal. In its early years, the richest ore could be processed using indigenous furnaces, known as huayaras. These small wind-powered furnaces took advantage of the strong air moving across the highlands. At night, their fires could be seen across the slopes. Over time, however, the most accessible high-quality ore became harder to find. Miners had to follow veins deeper into the mountain. While the remaining material contained less silver, lower-grade ore required another method. Mercury amalgamation made lower-grade ore profitable. The rock was crushed into powder and mixed with mercury, which bonded with the silver. The resulting material was then heated so that the mercury separated, leaving refined silver behind. The new process raised production and prolonged the mountain's profitable working life. It also carried poison through the entire chain. Much of the mercury came from Huancavelica in Peru, where another dangerous mining complex developed. Workers extracted the liquid metal there, transported it across the Andes, and used it in the processing yards of Potosí. Those handling mercury breathed its vapor, absorbed it through their skin, and worked near contaminated water and soil. Its effects accumulated slowly. Tremors and other forms of physical decline became familiar among those exposed for long periods. The refined silver that emerged at the end of the process, therefore, depended on two mines: the silver mountain at Potosí and the mercury deposits at Huancavelica. Both mines rested on labor. The Spanish colonial government adapted the Inca meter, an older system through which Andean communities had contributed labor to state projects. Under Spanish rule, the same name was applied to a compulsory rotation that supplied workers to Potosí. Communities across a defined region were required to send a portion of their adult male population to the mines each year. Men travelled from villages hundreds of miles away, often bringing their own food, clothing, and tools. They received wages, but those wages frequently failed to cover the cost of the journey and their daily needs. Underground work could continue through long shifts in cold, narrow, poorly ventilated spaces. Accidents, exhaustion, dust, and mercury exposure made the experience dangerous, even for those who eventually returned home. Communities left behind also carried the burden. Families lost workers during important agricultural seasons. Villages had to support the cost of travel and replacement labor. Some men paid others to serve in their place when they could afford it. Some communities moved beyond the legal boundaries from which meter workers were selected. The mines therefore changed settlement patterns across the Andes. Their influence reached far beyond the city visible beneath Cerro Rico. The human cost of Potosí became part of its reputation. Contemporary accounts offered enormous estimates of the number who died there. Later historians have questioned some of those figures, but the exaggeration itself reveals how the mountain was understood. To contemporaries, the mountain seemed to consume people. At the same time, Potosí became a symbol of almost unimaginable value. To say that something was worth a Potosí was to say that its price could scarcely be measured. The phrase remembered the silver more easily than the labour that produced it. Once refined, the metal entered an organised chain of transport and taxation. The crown claimed its royal fifth. Merchants handled the remainder through licensed commercial networks. Silver moved from the highlands toward the Pacific coast, or across inland routes, connecting Peru to the Atlantic system. Officials weighed it, registered it, and recorded the duties owed, from American ports. Much of it crossed the ocean in guarded fleets before entering the commercial world centered on Seville. Potosí was not Spain's only major source of silver. The mines of Zacatecas in New Spain also became enormous producers. Together, the American mining regions supplied a large share of the silver circulating through the early modern world. The sudden growth in the money supply had effects that Spain did not fully control. Prices rose across Western Europe during the 16th and early 17th centuries. Food, rent, and manufactured goods became more expensive. Wages did not always rise at the same pace. Later, economists called this long inflation the price revolution. For the Spanish monarchy, American silver offered immediate power. Future shipments could be promised to bankers in exchange for credit. The crown borrowed against wealth that had not yet crossed the Atlantic and used the money to support armies, fleets, fortifications, diplomacy, and dynastic commitments across Europe. Silver gave the monarchy power on a continental scale. It did not make the monarchy's expanding ambitions any cheaper. Spain increasingly purchased textiles, weapons, ship supplies, and finished goods from other European economies. Silver entered Spain and then moved outward again to foreign merchants and lenders. The crown's income was extraordinary, but its debts were often greater. Military commitments expanded as quickly as colonial revenue. Several times between the mid-16th and mid-17th centuries, the monarchy suspended payments to its creditors. The empire possessed the richest silver mines in the world and still struggled to meet its obligations. This was not simply a failure of accounting. It was one of the central structures of Spanish power. Because silver appeared to promise another shipment, another loan became possible. Because another loan was possible, another campaign could be financed. Each arrival of treasure supported commitments already made against the next arrival. The wealth of the mountain created strength and dependence at the same time. In Potosí, the shafts continued to descend. Mercury continued to arrive. Labourers continued to travel from distant communities. Merchants, officials, and priests continued to build their lives around the mine. Cerro Rico stood above them all, its shape appearing on maps and in accounts carried across Europe. The mountain had become more than an ore deposit. It was a meeting point between indigenous labour and Spanish law, between Andean geography and European credit, and between colonial suffering and global commerce. Its silver was already shaping another society. Silver did not stop at the mine gates or in royal ledgers. It shaped ordinary life across Spanish America every day, in streets, homes, markets, churches, workshops, and households. Silver reshaped life across Spanish America, birthplace. Ancestry, labour, and wealth shaped every household differently. By the mid-17th century, Spanish rule in the Americas had become more than an arrangement among soldiers, mines, and royal officials. Colonial cities had grown. Families had remained for generations on the same streets. Churches, markets, workshops, universities, estates, and indigenous towns had settled into patterns many residents regarded as ordinary. Around the silver, a distinct colonial society was taking shape. Colonial society, however, never fit a simple order. It was organized through a hierarchy of birthplace, ancestry, legal status, wealth, occupation, and reputation. These categories appeared orderly in official records. In daily life, they were constantly negotiated. Near the top stood the peninsulars, Spaniards born on the Iberian Peninsula who crossed the Atlantic to serve as senior officials, merchants, churchmen, and administrators. They were a small part of the population, but they held a large share of formal authority. Birth in Spain carried political weight. A peninsular was more likely to receive a high appointment than a person of similar wealth and ancestry born in the Americas. Maintaining an Iberian identity could therefore be both a matter of pride and a practical claim to status. Below them were the Creoles, or Criollos, people of Spanish descent, born in the Americas. By the 17th century, many Creole families had lived in New Spain or Peru for 3 or 4 generations. They owned estates, invested in mines, conducted trade, and built houses in cities such as Mexico City and Lima, their private chapels. Libraries, servants, imported fabrics, and silver ornaments displayed considerable wealth. Wealth could not erase the distinction of birthplace. Creoles could feel deeply attached to the monarchy and to Spanish culture, while also believing that their knowledge of American society entitled them to greater authority. They belonged to the empire, yet often found its highest offices reserved for recent arrivals from Spain. The resentment remained quiet, but it endured. Mestizos, born from Spanish and indigenous families, became increasingly numerous as communities lived, worked, traded, and formed households alongside one another. Officially, they occupied an uncertain position between Creoles and indigenous people. They might face restrictions in education, office holding, dress, or occupation. In practice, their lives depended on more than a single label. A prosperous mestizo artisan might live more comfortably than a poor Spaniard. A person with lighter skin, Spanish clothing, useful family connections, and a respected trade might present himself as Creole. The categories mattered, but they were not perfectly fixed. Identity became a negotiation carried out before priests, employers, neighbours, tax collectors, and courts. Indigenous communities supported the colonial order's broad base. They supplied much of its agricultural and mining labour and paid tribute to royal or local authorities. Yet they did not simply disappear into Spanish society. In many rural areas, communities retained their own lands, leaders, languages, and forms of internal government. Traditional authorities continued under titles such as cacique or gobernador. They collected tribute, represented their towns, and acted as intermediaries between their communities and colonial officials. Clothing also preserved memory. Indigenous men and women combined older regional forms with materials introduced from Europe. Wool entered local production, while Andean and Mesoamerican weaving traditions continued through generations. This continuity did not mean conquest had left these societies untouched. Their populations had been reduced, their labour redirected, and their religious institutions challenged, but survival remained beside disruption. African people and their descendants formed another indispensable part of Spanish America. Enslaved Africans were brought across the Atlantic, particularly to the Caribbean, the coastal lowlands of Mexico and Peru, and major port cities. They worked on estates, in households, in workshops, at docks, and as vendors or skilled artisans. Urban work could provide more movement than labour on isolated plantations, but enslaved people remained property under colonial law. Their families, labour, and freedom were subject to owners. Free black communities also developed. People described as mulattoes or pardos occupied another uncertain social space, shaped by wealth, occupation, family connections, and local custom. Colonial officials attempted to make this complexity legible through the Sistema de Castas. The system offered names for many combinations of ancestry. These labels multiplied into an elaborate vocabulary, and casta paintings turned them into carefully arranged family scenes. Clothing, occupations, household objects, and food were used to suggest each family's place in the social order. The paintings arranged society like a clean visual chart. Life outside their frames refused that neatness. Cities displayed hierarchy through space as well. A Spanish colonial city was commonly organized around a central plaza. The cathedral, government palace, and important commercial buildings stood around it. Streets extended outward in a grid. In Mexico City, the cathedral rose near the remains of the Templo Mayor. and stone from the earlier ceremonial centre entered new colonial construction. Architecture made a statement about authority, while preserving the physical presence of the world it claimed to replace. Markets filled the plaza with food and cloth. Religious processions crossed it on feast days. Royal announcements were read there. Status could be seen in clothing, position, gesture, and movement. Food revealed a different kind of order, created less by regulation than by daily life. Maize, beans, chili peppers, tomatoes, cacao, potatoes, and squash remained central to indigenous and mestizo diets. Europeans introduced wheat, cattle, pigs, chickens, sheep, olive oil, wine, and sugar. In wealthy households, meals followed Iberian customs when possible. On city streets and in ordinary kitchens, the traditions mixed more freely. Tamales could be filled with pork. Old world spices entered sauces made with local chilies. Chocolate was sweetened with sugar and cinnamon before travelling back across the Atlantic as a fashionable European drink. No royal council had designed this cuisine. It emerged from unequal contact, practical adaptation, and generations of daily life. The Catholic calendar gave daily life much of its rhythm. Saints' days, Lent, Easter, Corpus Christi, and local festivals organised the year. Processions, music, markets, and shared meals turned worship into public life. The church also established schools and universities. The universities of Mexico and Lima trained priests, lawyers, and physicians. Colonial intellectual life operated under censorship and religious oversight. Yet it still produced important writing. Sor Juana in Isla de la Cruz entered a convent in New Spain to pursue a life of study and became one of the most remarkable poets and thinkers of the Spanish-speaking world. Her career showed both colonial learning's possibilities and its limits. Spanish America was therefore not only a machine for extraction, though extraction remained central to it. It was a society built through coercion and creative adaptation at the same time. It produced rigid categories that people repeatedly crossed. It damaged indigenous institutions, while preserving indigenous languages, foods, and textiles. It relied on enslaved labour, while free black communities formed within its cities. It built cathedrals, universities, markets, and libraries within an order marked by deep inequality. Officials could regulate offices and record ancestry. They could not fully direct the culture that followed. And this society was not isolated on the western side of the Atlantic. Its silver, food, textiles, beliefs, and people were already entering routes that reached far beyond Spain. The Pacific carried American silver toward Asia. On Mexico's Pacific coast, ships were preparing to connect the Americas with Asia. The route took nearly half a century to understand. In 1519, the same year Cortés sailed toward Mexico, Ferdinand Magellan departed Spain under a Spanish commission. Magellan was Portuguese, but his proposal had found support from the Spanish crown. He intended to reach the spice markets of Asia by continuing west, completing in practice the voyage Columbus had imagined. 5 ships crossed the Atlantic and moved south along the coast of South America. After a long search, the expedition entered the narrow and difficult passage, now associated with Magellan's name. Beyond it lay an ocean whose scale the crew did not yet understand. The crossing of the Pacific lasted for months. Supplies disappeared. Hunger and illness reduced the crew as the ships moved across an expanse far greater than European maps had suggested. The expedition reached the Philippine Islands in 1521. Magellan did not complete the journey. He was killed during a local conflict on the island of Mactan. Command eventually passed to the Basque navigator Juan Sebastián Elcano, who led the surviving ship, the Victoria, westward across the Indian Ocean and around Africa. The Victoria returned to Spain in September 1522. Only 18 men from the original expedition completed the voyage. They had sailed around the world. The journey proved that the Atlantic and Pacific belonged to one connected oceanic system. It also revealed a practical problem. Ships could sail westward from the Americas toward Asia, carried by favourable winds. Returning east across the Pacific was far more difficult. For several decades, Spanish expeditions could reach the Philippines without possessing a dependable way back to New Spain. Some ships were forced to continue west through the Indian Ocean and follow the long route around Africa. A workable, reliable solution arrived in 1565. The Augustinian friar and navigator Andres de Urdaneta sailed north from the Philippines before turning east at higher latitudes. He found winds that carried his ship toward the coast of North America. The route became the tourné viage, or return voyage. With a reliable eastward crossing, the Pacific ceased to be a one-way frontier. It became a commercial route. A permanent Spanish settlement was established at Cebu in the same year. Manila became the colonial capital soon afterward. Its harbour stood at the meeting point of Spanish-American silver and the trading networks of East and Southeast Asia. From it, the Manila galleon trade developed for roughly 2.5 centuries, usually once or twice each year. A large ship sailed west from Acapulco. Its most important cargo was silver, coins minted in Mexico City and Lima, made from ore taken from Zacatecas, and Potosí crossed the Pacific in heavy chests. In Manila, merchants arrived from China, Japan, India, and Southeast Asia to exchange goods for that silver. Silk was among the most valuable products. Porcelain, lacquerware, ivory carvings, pepper, cinnamon, and spices from the islands of Southeast Asia filled the returning ships. These goods crossed the Pacific to Acapulco. From there, merchants carried them overland to Mexico City and onward toward the Atlantic. Some remained in Spanish-American households. Others continued to Europe. A piece of porcelain in Lima, a silk garment in Mexico City, and a silver coin in a Chinese market could all belong to the same commercial chain. China was the system's most important market. Under the Ming dynasty, silver had become central to taxation and monetary exchange. Yet China produced less silver domestically than its economy required. American silver arriving through Manila helped meet that demand. The metal extracted in the Andes therefore did more than enrich Spanish merchants or finance European wars. It entered Chinese markets and supported commercial transactions across Asia. The Pacific route now joined 3 continents in regular exchange. The galleons carrying this trade were among the largest wooden ships of their time. Many were built in the Philippines from strong tropical hardwoods and could carry several hundred tons of cargo. Size alone could not make the voyage safe. The eastward crossing from Manila to Acapulco could take 3 or 4 months. The ships passed through open water with few opportunities to obtain fresh food or make repairs. Storms could scatter cargo, break masts, or push vessels far from the North American coast. Over the centuries, dozens of galleons were lost to weather, reefs, or enemy action. Their crews included Spanish officers, indigenous Mexican sailors, and large numbers of Filipino workers. Many of the people who built, maintained, and sailed the ships survive only faintly in official records, though the trade depended on their knowledge and labour. Privateers soon followed the route. English raiders entered the Pacific and attacked Spanish shipping along the American coast. Francis Drake captured a treasure ship carrying an exceptionally valuable cargo before returning to England. Dutch ships later challenged Iberian interests more systematically and built their own Asian trading networks. Spain's oceanic monopoly existed, mainly as a legal claim. The farther its ships travelled, the more coastlines and sea lanes it had to defend. When a galleon reached Acapulco safely, the arrival transformed the port. A large fair gathered merchants who had travelled from the interior. Silver, colonial products, and credit were exchanged for Asian cargo. Silk and porcelain moved into American cities. Asian objects appeared in colonial households from Mexico to Peru. The trade changed the material world of Spanish America, as well as its commerce. The cargo's elegance could conceal the labour beneath it. The silver came from mines worked through coercive systems. Ships were constructed and crewed by labourers who carried much of the risk. Chinese merchants in Manila were required to live in a separate district and could become targets when colonial authorities feared their numbers or influence. The global network followed the same pattern, seen elsewhere in the empire. Profits gathered near its political and commercial centres, while danger and compulsory labour were spread across distant communities. Even with those costs, the achievement was substantial. A mountain in the Andes supplied silver to Mexico. The metal crossed the Pacific to Manila. Asian goods returned to Acapulco, travelled across New Spain, and entered the Atlantic world. For the first time, regular commerce connected the Americas, Europe, and Asia within a single continuing system. The Spanish monarchy now ruled territories and routes, extending across both great oceans. Spanish power had never reached farther. Distance itself was now the difficulty. The global monarchy's reach now exceeded its machinery. Its map now exceeded its machinery. Every order, soldier, shipment, and report still had to cross those distances slowly. By the 1580s, Philip II ruled one of the largest collections of territories ever governed by a European monarch. He had inherited Spain, the American possessions, and important lands in Italy from his father, Charles V. In 1580, he also secured the Portuguese crown, bringing Portugal, Brazil, African trading posts, and much of the Portuguese network in the Indian Ocean and Asia beneath the same dynasty. For a time, one ruler stood above ports and provinces stretching from Peru to the Philippines, from Brazil to Goa. The empire looked complete on a map. In practice, every distance created delay. Philip governed largely through documents. From the Escorial, his severe palace and monastery northwest of Madrid, he read reports, annotated petitions, and issued instructions to officials he might never meet. He was careful, serious, and deeply committed to Catholicism. He believed that defending the faith was not merely one responsibility of government, but one of the central purposes of his reign. This conviction gave his policies consistency. It also gave Spain commitments in almost every direction. In the Low Countries, provinces under Spanish rule had been in revolt since 1568. The conflict included disputes over taxation and local rights, but religion sharpened it. Protestant movements had gained strength, while Philip remained determined to preserve Catholic authority. The war became long, expensive, and difficult to finish. Spanish armies could win battles, but the geography of the region favoured fortified towns, rivers, and sustained resistance. Supplying troops required money and complicated routes across Europe. England added another pressure. Elizabeth I supported the Dutch rebels and allowed English privateers to attack Spanish commerce. These sailors occupied an uncertain space between merchants, raiders, and agents of the Crown. They targeted ships in the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, while giving the English government some distance from their actions. Francis Drake became the most famous among them. In 1587, he entered the harbour at Sea Cid and destroyed or captured ships being prepared for a Spanish expedition. The raid delayed Philip's plans, but did not end them. Philip answered the English challenge with a much larger plan. The fleet assembled in 1588 was officially called the Great and Most Fortunate Armada. It contained about 130 ships and carried sailors, soldiers, servants, priests, and supplies for a campaign intended to change the balance of power in northern Europe. From Madrid, the plan looked straightforward. The Armada would sail through the English Channel and reach the coast of Flanders. There, the Duke of Parma commanded a veteran Spanish army. His soldiers would board smaller vessels, join the fleet, and cross to England under naval protection. Its parts still had to meet at the same moment. The large Spanish ships required deep water. Parma's army waited near shallow Flemish ports. Dutch vessels watched the coast. Messages moved slowly, and changing winds could undo decisions made days earlier. Command of the fleet went to Alonso P. Firves de Guzman, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. He was a capable organizer, but he warned Philip that he lacked naval experience and suffered badly at sea. Philip left the appointment unchanged. The Armada left Lisbon in May 1588. Storms disrupted the fleet before it reached the Channel, forcing it to regroup and take on new supplies. When it sailed again in July, the English navy was ready. The English ships were generally lower and more manoeuvrable, Their commanders preferred to keep their distance and use longer-range cannon, rather than close with Spanish vessels for boarding combat. Spanish soldiers would have been dangerous in a close fight, so the English tried not to give them one. For several days, both fleets moved east through the Channel. The Spanish maintained a disciplined crescent formation. English cannon fire damaged ships and disrupted movement, but it did not immediately destroy the Armada. The direct fighting was serious, though less decisive than later legend often suggested. The unresolved problem was the rendezvous. When the Armada anchored near Calais, Parma's army was not ready to join it. The soldiers waited in ports too shallow for the great Spanish ships. The smaller transports needed to carry them outward were blocked by Dutch vessels that could operate close to shore. The two parts of the invasion force were separated by only a modest distance. That short distance proved enough. During the night, the English sent burning ships toward the anchored Armada. Unable to know whether the vessels carried explosives, Spanish captains cut their anchor cables and scattered to avoid them. The fires did not destroy the fleet, but they broke its formation. The following day, near Gravelines, the English attacked the disordered ships and inflicted the heaviest damage of the campaign. The Spanish were then pushed north by the wind. With the channel blocked behind them, they could not return by the route they had entered. The Armada had to sail around Scotland and Ireland before turning south toward Spain. The worst losses came during the return. The northern route passed through waters unfamiliar to many Spanish pilots. Ships were already damaged, supplies were low, and disease had spread among the crews. Atlantic storms drove vessels toward the rocky Irish coast. Some disappeared at sea. Others broke apart near shore. Only part of the original fleet returned to Spain. Many thousands of men had died, most not in direct combat but through storms, shipwreck, disease, hunger, and thirst. The campaign had plainly failed. Spanish power did not end overnight. Spain still possessed its American territories, its silver fleets, experienced armies, and an enormous network of ports. Philip prepared further naval expeditions, and the war with England continued without producing a simple English victory. The Armada mattered most for what it exposed. A global monarchy could not coordinate every moving part. Spain had ships, soldiers, money, and experienced commanders. What it could not reliably do was bring a deep-water fleet, a coastal transport force, a distant army, favourable winds, and timely information together in one narrow stretch of sea. The same empire was fighting in the Netherlands, defending Mediterranean interests, guarding Atlantic treasure routes, protecting Pacific commerce, and watching rivals across Europe and Asia. Each possession demanded another fortress, convoy, garrison, official, or loan. American silver allowed Spain to sustain these commitments longer than another monarchy might have managed. It did not make the commitments inexpensive. Each campaign created debts secured against future shipments. Each new enemy forced resources to be divided again. Philip died in 1598 with the world's largest empire. The treasury he left was again under severe pressure. The Armada had not destroyed the Spanish Empire. It had shown what the empire would spend in order to defend everything at once. Silver still crossed both oceans. Much of it was promised before the ships arrived. Silver arrived. Though the debts came first, that promise described the Spanish monarchy's finances at the beginning of the 17th century. Treasure ships still crossed the Atlantic, and mines in Mexico and Peru still produced extraordinary quantities of metal. Yet much of the wealth was committed to lenders, armies, officials, and wars before anyone opened the chests in Seville. Philip III inherited the system in 1598. Unlike his father, he did not try to read every report or direct every decision himself. He preferred to delegate. The man who benefited most was Francisco Gomez de Sandoval y Rojas, the Duke of Lerma, who became the king's principal favourite, or valido. A valido governed through personal access to the monarch. He was not simply a minister with a clearly defined office. His authority came from royal confidence, and that made his position powerful but unstable. Lerma used his influence to enrich his family and allies. Appointments, favours, and contracts flowed through networks of personal loyalty. When criticism and accusations of corruption gathered around him, he secured a cardinal's title, placing himself beyond the ordinary reach of secular prosecution. Government by favourites found its clearest symbol in Lerma. The deeper weakness, however, was not the behaviour of one man. It was the growing distance between the empire's income and the economy beneath it. American silver entered Spain, but it did not remain there for long. The monarchy purchased textiles, weapons, tools, furniture, and other manufactured goods from France, England, the Dutch Republic, and the Italian states. Foreign merchants accepted silver, while Spanish producers struggled to compete with imported goods. Bankers also claimed a large share. Genoese financial networks lent money against future royal revenue and helped move funds to armies across Europe. Silver reached Spain, passed through royal accounts, and continued outward. Spain increasingly became the corridor through which silver passed. Its rivals learned to retain and multiply that wealth. The Dutch Republic offered the clearest contrast. Its provinces were still fighting for independence from Spain, yet Dutch merchants were building one of Europe's most dynamic commercial systems. Amsterdam developed new forms of banking and exchange. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, gathered money from many investors and spread the risks of long-distance trade among them. The advantage was organisational as much as commercial. Spain relied heavily on royal borrowing and guarded monopolies. Dutch companies drew on wider pools of private capital, built large merchant fleets, and created trading posts throughout the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. American silver helped finance Spanish armies fighting the Dutch. At the same time, Dutch merchants used commerce, credit, and organisation to build the economy that would eventually outlast Spanish pressure. The monarchy also damaged its own economic base. In 1609, Philip III ordered the expulsion of the Moriscos, descendants of Muslims who had converted to Christianity but remained objects of suspicion. Over the following years, hundreds of thousands of people were removed from Spain. Many had been farmers, craftsmen, and artisans, especially in Valencia and Aragon. Their departure reduced tax revenue and disrupted communities whose agriculture depended on skilled labour and carefully maintained irrigation. The decision promised a more uniform faith. It also left farms and workshops empty. When Philip IV came to the throne in 1621, these problems had not disappeared. He inherited debt, dependence on foreign goods, war in the Low Countries, and a monarchy whose different kingdoms did not contribute equally to imperial defence. His principal minister, the Count, Duke of Olivares, understood the imbalance more clearly than many of his predecessors. Olivares was energetic, serious, and ambitious. He believed that Castile was carrying too much of the fiscal and military burden, while other parts of the monarchy protected older privileges. His proposed union of arms would require Castile, Aragon, Catalonia, Portugal, and other territories to provide troops and money in proportion to their resources. On paper, it was an attempt to distribute the cost of empire more evenly. In practice, the plan threatened local laws and privileges. The timing made the proposal even more difficult. Spain had entered the 30 Years' War, a conflict that began within the Holy Roman Empire and expanded into a struggle involving most of Europe's major powers. Spanish forces fought partly in defence of Catholic allies and partly to preserve the route connecting Italy with the Spanish Netherlands. War demanded men, taxes, transport, and credit. Olivares asked each region to supply more. In 1640, pressure broke in two places. Catalonia revolted after years of tension over troops, taxation, and local privileges. Suppressing the rebellion required a long and costly campaign. Castilian control was eventually restored, but only after further expense and political compromise. Portugal rebelled as well. The Portuguese crown had been joined to Spain since 1580, but Portuguese elites had never ceased to think of their kingdom as distinct. Spain's military difficulties created an opportunity. The Duke of Braganza was proclaimed King João IV, and Portugal began a war to recover its independence. This separation became permanent. Spain had once gained the Portuguese Empire through dynastic union. It lost it because the larger monarchy could no longer defend every part while demanding greater sacrifice from all of them. Later, treaties confirmed the changing balance. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia brought formal recognition of Dutch independence. Spain acknowledged the result of a conflict that had lasted for 80 years. In 1659, the Treaty of the Pyrenees ended another war with France and required Spain to surrender territory. France was becoming the leading continental power, while Spain was losing the position it had held under Charles V and Philip II. The empire itself did not disappear. Spanish America remained vast. Silver still crossed the Atlantic. Mexico City and Lima continued to govern immense territories. Manila still connected the Pacific world, and Spanish armies remained formidable. The monarchy, however, had less room to maneuver. Its revenues were tied to debt. Its industries were weak beside those of its competitors. Its kingdoms resisted central demands. Its military victories no longer produced lasting solutions. The imperial structure still stood. The strength behind it was tiring. By the end of the 17th century, the final Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, had no surviving heir. His death would not merely end a family line. It would force the powers of Europe to decide who would inherit the monarchy and whether its territories could remain together. Spain had spent a century defending an inheritance too large for one crown. Now that inheritance itself was about to become the cause of another war, the Bourbons tried a different repair. The Bourbon repair began with a succession crisis, not with an administrative plan. When Charles II died in 1700, he left no surviving child. His death ended the Spanish Habsburg line and opened a question that concerned every major power in Europe: who would inherit Spain, its American colonies, the Philippines, and the remaining territories attached to the monarchy. The succession dispute drew England, Austria, Portugal, France, and the Dutch toward war. Charles's will named Philip of Anjou, a grandson of Louis XIV of France. The choice offered the possibility of French protection for a weakened Spanish monarchy. It also raised the fear that Spain and France might become parts of a single Bourbon power. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and Portugal supported a rival claimant, Archduke Charles of Austria. The War of the Spanish Succession began in 1701 and spread across Europe, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean. After more than a decade of war, the settlement reached at Utrecht in 1713 allowed Philip of Anjou to remain king as Philip V, the first Bourbon monarch of Spain. Philip retained mainland Spain and most American possessions. Spain surrendered much of its European position. The Spanish Netherlands and several Italian territories passed to other powers. Britain received Gibraltar and Minorca. British merchants also gained the Asiento, a contract allowing them to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonial markets. The agreement gave Britain a legal commercial entrance into an empire whose trade Spain had long attempted to reserve for itself. The Bourbon dynasty brought a different governing style. The Habsburg monarchy had been a collection of kingdoms and provinces, each preserving many of its own laws, institutions, and privileges. Bourbon ministers favoured greater uniformity and stronger central direction. Between 1707 and 1716, the Nueva Planta decrees abolished many of the separate institutions of Aragon, Valencia, and Catalonia and replaced them with a more Castilian model of administration. Royal government became more unified under the reforms. They also left memories of punishment and lost autonomy, particularly in regions that had supported the Austrian claimant during the war. The Bourbon project was therefore a repair, but not a restoration of the old order. It attempted to make the monarchy more governable by changing the monarchy itself. The most energetic period of reform came under Charles III, who became king in 1759. Charles surrounded himself with ministers who believed that government could be improved through more rational taxation, administration, defence, and commerce. The state tried to gather better information, collect more reliable revenue, and reduce the independence of powerful local interests. Commercial rules were loosened so that more Spanish ports could trade with the Americas rather than forcing so much legal commerce through a single gateway. The military was reorganized, and colonial administration was adjusted to respond more quickly to threats and to increase royal income. New viceroyalties served the same purpose. New Granada was created to give closer supervision to North and South America. The Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata was established in 1776, with Buenos Aires as its capital. Territories once governed from distant Lima now received a political centre on the southern Atlantic. Efficiency explained part of the change. Defence explained the rest. British and Portuguese activity made the Atlantic coast increasingly difficult to protect from Peru. A government in Buenos Aires could respond more quickly to local danger, supervise trade, and collect revenue closer to where it was produced. The Crown also confronted institutions it considered too independent. In 1767, the Jesuits were expelled from Spain and its colonies. The order had created extensive schools and missions, and had become especially influential in frontier regions, such as Paraguay. To royal ministers, some Jesuit communities appeared to operate with too much economic and political independence. Their removal strengthened the Crown's authority, but it also disrupted missions that had organized the lives of many indigenous communities. Bourbon government became more active. Greater activity did not always mean gentler rule. Events abroad showed both reform's necessity and its limits. Spain entered the 7 Years' War late, on the French side. In 1762, British forces captured Havana and Manila, two of the most important ports in the empire. Both were returned in the peace settlement, but the shock was lasting. The captures demonstrated that even the empire's most valuable gateways could be reached by a powerful naval rival. Spain surrendered Florida to Britain and received Louisiana from France as compensation. The exchange enlarged Spain's territory on a map, while also giving it another vast region that was difficult to populate, administer, and defend. The American Revolution created a difficult strategic choice. Spain had little reason to encourage colonial rebellion as an idea. Its ministers could easily imagine the consequences for Spanish America. Weakening Britain, however, was too valuable to ignore. Spain entered the war in 1779 as an ally of France, rather than as a direct ally of the American revolutionaries. Spanish forces fought around the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, and Florida returned to Spanish control in the settlement of 1783. Territorially, the outcome looked useful. Politically, it carried a less comfortable meaning. A colonial population had broken from a European monarchy and created a new government. The example could not be confined to the former British colonies. The French Revolution pushed the challenge further. After 1789, ideas about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the legitimacy of inherited rule crossed the Atlantic in books, pamphlets, newspapers, and private conversation. The Bourbon reforms had encouraged education and administrative professionalism. They had also produced colonial elites capable of reading new political arguments and comparing them with their own position. Creole families had lived in the Americas for generations. Many owned land, mines, businesses, and urban property. Yet the Crown increasingly sent peninsular officials from Spain to occupy senior offices that Creoles believed should belong to people with local experience. The reforms collected more taxes, restricted local privilege, and placed administration more firmly under royal control. From Madrid, the changes looked efficient. From Mexico City, Lima, Bogota, or Buenos Aires, it could look like exclusion. The Bourbon monarchy had strengthened fleets, reorganized provinces, expanded trade, and made colonial government more productive. For a time, its revenues and defences improved. The repair also created fresh pressures. It asked the colonies to contribute more while reminding their elites that final authority remained across the ocean. It educated administrators, who were denied the highest positions. It loosened commerce while watching local merchants more closely. It defended the empire by making its rule more visible in everyday life. By the end of the 18th century, the Spanish Empire was not waiting passively to collapse. Real energy had gone into that repair. The structure was stronger in several places than it had been a century earlier. But the people holding it together had begun to disagree about whom the structure was meant to serve. The roots still held. Then Napoleon reached for Spain's crown. Then Napoleon displaced the monarchy's centre entirely. The Bourbon monarchy had made imperial rule more efficient, centralised, and demanding. Bourbon rule had reorganised provinces, revised taxation, expanded trade, and rebuilt military institutions. The same work raised a deeper question. If the empire depended on the authority of a distant monarch, what happened when that monarch disappeared? France supplied the answer. Napoleon had not set out to destroy Spain's American empire. Spain had been drawn into the French orbit through alliance agreements and shared hostility toward Britain. The two countries fought together against a common enemy, but the relationship increasingly placed Spain in a dangerous position. Disaster first arrived at sea. On the 21st of October, 1805, the combined Franco-Spanish fleet met the British Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson near Cape Trafalgar. The battle ended within 5 hours. The combined fleet paid dearly. The French and Spanish lost 22 ships. Britain lost none. Nelson was killed during the battle, but his victory destroyed the naval force that Spain needed to protect Atlantic communications. For centuries, the empire had depended on ships to connect Madrid with Havana, Veracruz, Cartagena, Lima, and Manila. After Trafalgar, Atlantic communication became far more fragile. Spain still ruled enormous territories, but it could no longer guarantee the movement of people, information, and military force across the oceans. Under Charles IV, the crisis deepened. The king had increasingly relied on his chief minister Manuel Godoy, a figure whose rise through royal favour made him deeply unpopular among many political groups. The royal court became divided by personal rivalries and uncertainty. The monarchy appeared unable to respond effectively as Napoleon's influence expanded across Europe. In March 1808, a revolt at the royal palace of Aranjuez forced Godoy from power and pushed Charles to abdicate in favour of his son, Ferdinand VII. Napoleon recognised the opening. He invited both father and son to Bayonne in France, supposedly to mediate their dispute. Bayonne offered no genuine mediation. Napoleon pressured Ferdinand to return the crown to Charles. Charles then surrendered his claim to Napoleon, who transferred the Spanish throne to his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Joseph became King of Spain in May 1808. The transfer followed the internal logic of Napoleon's empire. A European kingdom could be reorganized through dynastic decisions made by powerful rulers. Spain, however, was not merely a diplomatic possession. The new king met immediate rejection. On May 2, 1808, Madrid rose against French troops stationed in the city. The uprising was suppressed with brutal force. The executions carried out on May 3 became the subject of Francisco de Goya's famous paintings, images that captured the violence and desperation of occupation. Madrid's rebellion opened what Spaniards called their War of Independence. For 6 years, Spain became one of Napoleon's hardest battlefields. The conflict was not fought only by regular armies. Local resistance groups organised attacks against French forces, creating a form of irregular warfare that gave the world the word guerrilla. French armies could occupy cities and win set battles. Holding the countryside proved much harder. Across Spain, local juntas formed to govern in the absence of a functioning central monarchy. These bodies claimed to preserve legitimate authority, while Ferdinand remained imprisoned in France. The juntas revealed something else. Political authority could exist outside the old absolute monarchy. The resistance gradually centred on Cadiz, a port city protected from French occupation by its location and naval access. There, representatives gathered in the Cortes, a national assembly that attempted to define a new political order. In 1812, the Cortes completed the Constitution of Cadiz. Few constitutional documents written during that era were more liberal. It declared that sovereignty rested with the nation rather than simply with the monarch. It limited royal authority and introduced representative institutions. The document was created during a war against foreign occupation, but its implications reached much further, across the Atlantic. It raised a fundamental question. If Spaniards in Europe could claim political authority during a crisis, why could American communities not do the same? Events were already supplying an answer. The colonial system had always depended on the legitimacy of the Spanish crown. The king represented the connection between Madrid and the Americas. The old connection had collapsed. The legitimate king remained a prisoner. A French monarch occupied Spain's throne. Local governments now governed parts of Spain. The colonies faced a question the old system could not answer. Where did legitimate loyalty now belong? During 1810, answers appeared across Spanish America, in Caracas. On the 19th of April, a local junta removed the Spanish captain general and began governing in the name of Ferdinand. The language was initially cautious. Many movements claimed loyalty to the imprisoned king rather than openly declaring independence. Creating those governments had already changed the political ground in Buenos Aires. The May Revolution of 1810 established another junta in the Arfrio de la Plata. In Bogotá, the events of the 20th of July 1810 began a process of self-government in New Granada. Santiago formed a Chilean national junta that September. Mexico's uprising took a different form. On the 16th of September 1810, a priest named Miguel Hidalgo rang the church bell in the town of Dolores and called his followers to rise against bad government. Hidalgo was no wealthy Creole, arranging a cautious constitutional program. He had connections among indigenous and mestizo communities, and the movement that followed became a massive social uprising. Indigenous communities, agricultural workers, and poor mestizos joined his movement. Many Creole elites found the uprising alarming. They had long criticized Spanish restrictions, but they also feared a revolution that might overturn the entire social order. Royal forces captured and executed Hidalgo in 1811. His rebellion did not end. The empire had entered a crisis that could no longer be solved simply by sending new officials from Madrid. Spain's difficulty was not purely military. Its center was political. The Bourbon reforms had made colonial society more connected, more educated, and more economically active. They had also created generations of American-born elites who understood the empire's institutions and increasingly questioned their place within them. Napoleon had never planned Spanish America's destruction. He intended only to control Spain, but by removing the traditional source of legitimacy, he created the exact condition that allowed colonial governments to imagine a different future. The empire had survived wars, rebellions, financial crises, and foreign attacks for centuries. The system had always rested on one central idea: the king's authority joined territories separated by oceans. That idea no longer held. Independence did not erase imperial structures. Once the royal connection broke, the Atlantic world began to separate. The colonies had already practiced government beyond direct royal supervision. Ferdinand VII returned to Spain in 1814, after Napoleon's defeat. For those who had resisted French occupation, his restoration seemed at first to promise the return of legitimate government. Instead, Ferdinand abolished the constitution of CCDs, imprisoned many of the liberals who had written it, and attempted to restore absolute monarchy. For the Americas, Ferdinand chose reconquest. Royal armies recovered ground in several regions. Venezuela was briefly brought back under Spanish control, and Simón Bolívar was forced into exile. Yet military success could not solve the deeper problem. The colonies had governed themselves during the crisis. Local leaders had raised troops, collected taxes, issued laws, and defended territory. They had discovered that royal authority was not the only possible foundation of government. The old relationship could not simply be restored as though 1808 had never happened. Distance worked against Spain. Reinforcements crossed slowly. Armies operated across mountains, plains, forests, and coastlines, thousands of miles from Madrid. Creole elites who had once asked for greater influence were increasingly unwilling to return to their former position. Independence followed different paths from one region to another. In northern South America, Bolívar rebuilt his movement after exile. His forces crossed difficult country and won the Battle of Boyac in 1819, securing the centre of New Granada and opening the way for a larger republic. Farther south, Josta de San Martí organised an army in the Rio de la Bate in 1817. It crossed the Andes into Chile along high and dangerous routes that seemed almost designed to prevent an army from passing. Chilean independence was secured, and the Allied forces then turned north toward Peru, the old centre of Spanish power in South America. Mexico took another path. The uprising begun by Miguel Hidalgo had frightened many wealthy Creoles because it joined political rebellion with social anger from indigenous and mestizo communities. For years, conservative elites hesitated to support independence. Events in Spain then changed the calculation. In 1820, a military revolt led by Rafael del Riego forced Ferdinand to restore the constitution of 1812. Liberals again gained influence in the peninsula. To some conservative leaders in New Spain, a constitutional government in Madrid now appeared more threatening than separation. Agustín de Iturbide, a royalist commander, changed sides. In 1821, his forces entered Mexico City, and Mexico became independent. Central America followed soon afterward. The political map changed quickly. Bolívar's campaigns continued in the north. San Martí's forces advanced from the south. Their movements approached one another around Peru, where the final struggle against Spanish rule would be decided. In December 1824, forces under Antonio Gossi de Sucre defeated the main royal army at Ayacucho. The battle ended the last significant Spanish military power in continental South America. By 1825, the American Empire that had taken generations to construct had largely dissolved. Spain retained Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, the Philippines in the Pacific, and several smaller possessions. The largest empire in the Western world had become a European kingdom with distant remnants. No single defeat had caused the collapse. It had come through a sequence of failures in legitimacy, compromise, communication, and political imagination. The monarchy could imagine obedience or rebellion. It struggled to imagine a shared constitutional empire in which American communities possessed meaningful equality. At the moment when compromise might have preserved some form of union, Ferdinand offered restoration and force. The continental colonies chose other futures. Those futures brought their own difficulties. The new nations inherited borders drawn through colonial administration. They inherited Spanish law, Catholic institutions, concentrated landholding, racial categories, and cities built around the old plazas of imperial government. Creole leaders replaced peninsular officials at the top of many societies. The structure beneath them often changed more slowly. Independence ended government from Madrid. It did not remove the colonial foundations. Spain's remaining empire lasted through most of the 19th century. Cuba became its most important surviving colony, and also the site of repeated rebellion. The island's wealth, plantations, and strategic position made it valuable to Spain and increasingly important to the United States. By the 1890s, Cuban independence forces were again at war with Spanish rule. American political pressure, newspaper campaigns, sympathy for the rebels, and the destruction of a United States warship in Havana Harbor pushed the two countries toward conflict. War opened in April 1898. It ended within a few months. In Manila Bay, an American fleet destroyed Spain's Pacific Squadron. In Cuba, American and Cuban forces pushed Spanish troops from their remaining positions. The Treaty of Paris closed the war that December. Spain gave up Puerto Rico and Guam, relinquished its claim to Cuba, and transferred the Philippines to the United States in exchange for payment. The treaty ended Spain's last large overseas empire. For Spanish writers and thinkers who came of age afterward, the defeat became known simply as the disaster. The generation of 1898 examined the country's history with a seriousness that imperial confidence had often discouraged. They asked what Spain had been, what it had lost, and what kind of nation remained when the language of global empire no longer explained it. The decisive imperial collapse, however, had come decades earlier. What ended in 1898 was the final structure left after the American revolutions. What endured was harder to measure. Language remained the most visible inheritance. Spanish became the dominant language across much of the Americas. But it did not remain unchanged. It absorbed words from Taíno, Nahuatl, Quechua, and many other indigenous languages. It developed regional rhythms and vocabularies shaped by local history. The Spanish spoken in Mexico, the Caribbean, the Andes, and the Arroyo de la Plata carried Castilian foundations into societies Spain itself had never fully controlled. Language preserved imperial history. It also moved beyond imperial control. Catholicism remained another powerful inheritance. Churches, festivals, saints, and religious calendars survived independence and continued to organize community life. Yet American Catholicism had never been a simple copy of Iberian practice, indigenous beliefs, African traditions, local landscapes, and colonial experience entered it from the beginning. The Virgin of Guadalupe became a central symbol in Mexico because the devotion belonged at once to Christian theology and to a specifically American story of place, image, and indigenous encounter. Comparable adaptations appeared across the former empire. The political inheritance was more difficult. Colonial government had been centralized and hierarchical. Its institutions had been designed to collect tribute, manage labor, defend trade, and carry orders from above. The new republics inherited those institutions while trying to build representative governments. They inherited large estates and unequal access to land. They inherited courts and administrative boundaries created for imperial purposes. The new nations also inherited divisions that independence alone could not erase. The caste labels of the colonial period lost their formal authority. But inequality did not disappear with the words. Indigenous communities, African descendants, mestizos, and the rural poor continued to live within systems shaped by conquest and colonial labor. The population loss behind those systems was immense. Disease caused the largest share of indigenous population loss after European contact. Forced labor, warfare, displacement, and hunger made recovery more difficult. Communities survived, not because the colonial transformation had been mild, but because people adapted with extraordinary persistence. Their descendants remained within the new nations, preserving languages, textiles, farming knowledge, memory, and political traditions that imperial records often treated as marginal. Imperial exchange also transformed the natural world. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, chili peppers, tobacco, and many other American plants traveled eastward. Wheat, cattle, pigs, sheep, horses, and new diseases traveled west. These exchanges reshaped diets, agriculture, population, and landscapes far beyond Spain's formal borders. The horse provides one quiet example. Animals brought by the Spanish moved north through indigenous trade networks into regions the empire never governed effectively. On the plains of North America, they helped create new forms of travel, hunting, trade, and warfare. An imperial introduction entered indigenous worlds beyond imperial control. No single judgment can hold this history together. The Spanish Empire destroyed political orders and built new cities. It extracted wealth through coercion and created courts in which the morality of conquest could be argued. It suppressed languages while spreading another language that later became a vehicle for voices from every part of the former empire. Its violence was not unique among empires. Its timing, reach, and influence were. It connected oceans before any state fully understood the world it had connected. Silver from an Andean mountain reached Chinese markets. Asian porcelain entered Mexican homes. American foods transformed European fields and kitchens. The costs of connection were distributed unevenly. That imbalance also shaped the world that followed. An old map of the empire might show broad fields of colour across oceans and continents. Those colours have faded. The borders they represented are gone, but beneath them remain roads, ports, cathedrals, plazas, languages, legal habits, family histories, foods, music, and memories. Granada's keys once ended one era and opened another. Centuries later, the empire's final political doors closed. Ships no longer sailed under the old commands. Silver no longer crossed oceans for the same crown. History did not vanish with the lowered flags. It settled into the ground, beneath millions of lives. There, in altered forms, it remains.